because I noticed I don't really have any videos on the war in Yemen on my channel, and I feel like it's about time I had made one, right? So I feel like I'm gonna end today's stream by talking about that a little bit. And I want to make a video kind of like going through the history of the war in Yemen, because it's something where I feel like a lot of people don't really... This is how I feel like most people know about the war in Yemen. They know that there's a war, and that somehow we're involved, somehow the Saudis are involved, and honestly, that's probably where the knowledge of most people starts. Some people might know that the Iranians are involved. Some people might hear the like something about the Houthis, right? That's like the realm of what most people know about the war in Yemen, right? And so I think in the future, I'm probably going to bring on somebody who knows a decent amount about the war in Yemen, because I know more than that, but I still like don't have like the tightest of grasps on the history of Yemen. I don't know about the history of the two Yemens, when there was a communist Yemen and there was a not communist Yemen, and I want to like have somebody come on with me and like talk about that history in the future. But that's not what we're doing today. So when Biden stepped into office, he made a lot of statements about the war in Yemen specifically. And one thing he talked about consistently was that he was going to work to end the war in Yemen. There was a few things that he wanted to do. He said, like, talking about using diplomacy and reversing the failed strategy of his predecessors when it comes to Yemen, which has helped kill a significant amount of people. How many people? Well, if you believe the United Nations, and some of these numbers are out of date, so this is probably an even higher number. But if you were to go through this report, we're talking about 377,000 people are dead. Let me say that again. 377,000 people have died in Yemen. Only 150,000 of them have died as the direct contribution of conflict. The majority have died from things like malnutrition, lack of water supply, lack of food supply, stuff like that. Stuff that has been worsened through the US-backed Saudi blockade. What is that? Maybe we can get into that in the future. Or we'll have to talk about a little bit more of that in this video in the future. But not only has 377,000 people died, but let's talk about the people who are currently being affected by this. This is the the World Food Program. Up to 19 million people are food insecure. 20.7 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance in the year 2020, and 3.5 million pregnant and breastfeeding women and children under 5 are suffering from acute malnutrition. Acute malnutrition. That means, I don't know how to describe that. But basically, you know those videos where you see somebody with like an inflated stomach and you can see their ribs? We're talking about that situation. We're not talking about, man, I'm kind of hungry, okay? We're talking about, these are people who are slowly starving. These are people who are an inch from death's door. That's what we're talking about here. And we're talking about children under 5 and pregnant women and breastfeeding women. This music is probably not the most appropriate. I think if we just turned it down a little bit, maybe that would help. Okay, so what we have in Yemen is probably the worst humanitarian disaster in the world. When we talk about Ukraine, it is a humanitarian disaster caused by Putin's government. Let's not split hairs there. The last report from Mariupol's mayor is about 5,000. This is like higher estimates. 5,000 people dead in Mariupol. We're talking about thousands more dead throughout the country. Right? Intense fighting going on. And that is a humanitarian disaster that should not be underplayed by anyone. 5,000 dead is 2,000 more than the people who died on 9/11, and that's just one city. But 377,000 with a war that's has no end in sight. with a malnutrition issue of this scale, when we talk about 19 million people being food insecure and 20.7 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, that is a gigantic number. I mean, just by hearing 20 million, that is already a large number. But Yemen population, 29.8 million. So we'll round up to 30. That means 2 out of every 3 people in Yemen are in dire need of humanitarian assistance, and around 2 out of every 3 people in Yemen are food insecure. With 377,000 dead, the majority of are dead because of the blockade, because of food insecurity, etc. The blockade. Let's talk about that a little bit, right? So when we talk about the blockade in Yemen, maybe we can find an image of the blockade? Yemen blockade. What if we have images of it? I know you can get satellite images, but I wonder if you can get actual images. I guess not. I guess you can't really get images of the ships, can you? Well, I guess we'll just have to go with this picture. Okay. When we talk about the blockade in Yemen, what we talk about is the Saudi blockade. So there is this group of people. We're going to give very bare bones history here. In the future, we're going to get more in depth to it. So there is a Saudi-backed government in Yemen and Houthi rebels. The Houthi rebels are in the west of the country in some of the more mountainous terrain, and they have captured the capital. And they have been fighting a brutal civil war with the Saudi-backed government for a very long period of time. The United States during that period has sold weapons to Saudi Arabia that have been used in Yemen, many of which have actually ended up killing civilians. We have supported them in many different aspects in the war in Yemen, and I think that includes intelligence sharing. And we have also conducted our own strikes in the region, not necessarily on the Houthis. Sometimes we've struck like terror organizations like Al-Qaeda. I believe it was Al-Qaeda in Yemen as well. But what the Saudis have done in a tactic to try to strangle the Houthi government and the Houthi rebels that have captured the capital and hold the west of the country. I think the capital's Sana'a. I never know how to pronounce it correctly. Let's make sure I'm right. Yep, I'm correct. I just can't pronounce it correctly. They have decided that they are going to blockade fuel. Now, saying that they're going to blockade fuel doesn't necessarily like translate directly in your mind to food insecurity, a lack of water, etc. But everything in Yemen runs on fuel. If you want to run a generator to power hospitals that are necessary to keep people who are at death's door alive, that hospital is going to need fuel. If you want to put fuel in trucks that have vital aid that have been brought in by humanitarian groups, you're going to need fuel. If you want to transport people to hospitals, you're going to need fuel. In Yemen, fuel is king when it comes to getting people the assistance they need. It is also king when it comes to like fueling tanks of the tanks or armor, anything like that. And so that's why the government in Yemen, the government in Saudi Arabia is claiming that they need to blockade this fuel. Now, I would also say that I think a lot of it is that they want to force the Houthis into an unfavorable negotiating position by strangling their population. That is me being honest. The government in Saudi Arabia, and I would even say the government in Washington, D.C. will deny that, but that is my honest opinion about what they're doing. It's everything. It's all logistics, as somebody brought up in chat. It's all logistics, right? So, the United States has backed this blockade. And like I said earlier, the majority of people who have died in Yemen have not died due to bullets, bombs, or tank treads. They have died due to things like malnutrition, in large part. And this is according to humanitarian organizations. You can check with them. You don't need to check with me if you don't believe me. Do your own independent research. Don't trust a random streamer on the internet to give you all of your opinions. That blockade has worsened that humanitarian catastrophe. And this was the humanitarian catastrophe that Biden said he wanted to work to end. Don't take it from me. Let's listen to the man himself. Oh, I also do want to say, before before
today,
Biden starts talking, that Biden hasn't completely done nothing on Yemen. Something that Trump did while getting out of office was he put the Houthis on a terrorist watch list. Now, the Houthi rebels, and this isn't like all Houthis, but as in the Houthi rebel government, the Houthi rebels, so to speak, they have engaged in terrible activities, torture, killing civilians. You get the idea, right? So Trump put them on a terrorist watch list. Now, on its face, you're like, okay, well, if they've done bad things, who cares? The problem is, by putting the Houthis on a terrorist watch list, what that did is it made it more difficult for humanitarian organizations, which have to work with the Houthis in order to get aid into the country, to do that work in the country. And so we saw banks pulling out. We saw humanitarian organizations pulling out. We saw all these organizations withdrawing, trying to get out of the country so they won't have their resources targeted by the United States federal government. And Biden reversed that ban. To political risk to himself, by the way. You could see how Republicans would point to some of the things the Houthi rebels have done and said, this is the group that Biden has removed from the terrorist watch list. Thankfully, we haven't really seen much Republican messaging on this. Maybe it's because the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen is so terrible that it's not really one that's going to work in the Republicans' favor when it comes to attacking Biden on it if he's doing something that's going to get resources into the country. But that is something good he's done. He's also while he hasn't stopped all weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, he did for a period of time. I don't know how long that's lasted. I don't even know if it's continued to last up to this point. I'll have to double check. He has suspended certain offensive weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. Is that enough? Not at all. But I also want to make sure that I give proper credit where credit is due. But most of this has ended up being ineffective in really relieving Yemen's suffering. But let's let Biden talk about his promises. Now, he made promises on the campaign trail to fight to end the war in Yemen. This is right after he became elected, and he starts talking about the conflict. So let's hear what he has to say. This is about 1 year and a month ago.
I'm announcing additional steps to course correct our foreign policy and better unite our democratic values with our diplomatic leadership. To begin, Defense Secretary Austin will be leading a global posture review of our forces so that our military footprint is appropriately aligned with our foreign policy and national security priorities. It will be coordinated across all elements of our national security, with Secretary Austin and Secretary Blinken working in close cooperation. And while this review is taking place, we'll be stopping any planned troop withdrawals from Germany. We're also stepping up our diplomacy to end the war in Yemen, a war which has created a humanitarian and strategic catastrophe. I've asked my Middle East team to ensure our support for the United Nations-led initiative to impose a ceasefire, open humanitarian challenge, and restore long-dormant peace talks. This morning, Secretary Blinken appointed Tim Lenderking, a career foreign policy officer, as our special envoy to the Yemen conflict, and I appreciate him doing this. Tim has lifelong experience in the region, and he'll work with the UN envoy and all parties to the conflict to push for a diplomatic resolution. And Tim's diplomacy will be bolstered by USAID working to ensure that humanitarian aid is reaching the Yemeni people who are suffering unendurable devastation. This war has to end. And to underscore our commitment, we are ending all American support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen, including relevant arms sales.
So, I want to say that when I first started my content creation, one of the oldest videos on my channel, I think it's a debate with Angie Speaks, actually. Let me see if I can find it. If I can find it. Angie Speaks, Dylan Burns. Right here. I have a debate about Bernie or bust. Right here. And in this debate, oh my god, I look young. Man, it's been a crazy 2 years. Anyway, um, in this debate with Angie Speaks, not only is she extremely aggravatingly not letting anyone else talk, but I'm trying to talk about the war in Yemen, and one of my justifications for voting for Biden was because, and this was amongst many others, so my position hasn't changed at all, was that he would be better than Trump when it came to the war in Yemen. His campaign promises then started to reflect that, and in his first months in office, he did show himself to be better than Trump on the war in Yemen. But these bold pronouncements from President Joe Biden about how he's going to take on the Saudi war machine, and he's going to stop selling all these weapons, and we're going to get humanitarian aid into the country. While he had the outline of a plan to do this in place, that just didn't end up happening. Let's talk about that. This is from The Intercept. In the last year, Saudi Arabia tightened a devastating fuel blockade. One second. Is this where... Okay, here is them actually talking about this. This war has to end, Biden said in his first address as president, noting that the conflict had created a humanitarian and strategic catastrophe. He pledged to halt all American support for offensive operations in Yemen, including relevant arms sales. Progressives welcomed the announcement, we did, and new administrations basked in the glow of positive press coverage. However, just over a year later, Yemen's humanitarian crisis is worse by many accounts than when Trump was president. In the last year, Saudi Arabia tightened a devastating fuel blockade that it's the Saudi capital, has long used as a war tactic. As Biden was entering the White House, commercial fuel imports to Yemen ground to a halt with no fuel. Let me say that. No fuel, which completely undermines all logistics within the country. Entering Yemen's, this is like their main port, for 52 days from January 28th to March 21st, 2 months, according to a report from the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Can I also say, I might be misremembering this, but if I remember, the Biden administration, actually, the White House denied that this was the case. They literally lied. They just denied it. They denied that this was happening. Am I right about this? That they were denying this was happening during the early months of the Biden administration, the first 2 months? Could have sworn that was the case. This is an alarming development, considering that more than half of Yemen's commercial fuel imports had been coming through this port in recent years, the report noted, referring to the port, which is administered by the Houthi-dominated government and through which 70% of Yemen's imports enter the country. The agency called the shutoff a precedent not seen since the beginning of the conflict in 2015. On February 4th, 2021, Biden appointed Tim Lenderking as a special envoy to Yemen. Soon afterward, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken removed the Houthis from a terror list. This was all good things. Mike Pompeo had issued his final days, which the United Nations many aid groups had warned would severely impact the roughly 24 million Yemenis who still live in Houthi-held territory. The Biden administration made clear that the designation was mainly to alleviate or at least not worsen the suffering of Yemeni civilians who live under Houthi control. It didn't work out that way. In a field visit to Yemen in March of last year, World Food Program Executive Director David Bailey sounded the alarm, saying that the dire effects of the fuel shortages included widespread power outages at hospitals. This is what I was talking about. Power outages at hospitals where you already have 377 million people dead. You've got millions in dire need, 20 million in need of humanitarian assistance. You've got 19 million who are food insecure, 3.5 million children who are food insecure, or pregnant women who are in need of this assistance. And let's say they're knocking on death's door due to disease or hunger or thirst or any of these things that could be caused by the blockade. You go to a hospital, power outages. All the systems designed to keep you clinging to life, to keep newborns clinging to life. Boom, power outages. And during those power outages, people die. I mean, I think that's kind of like obvious, right? During these power outages, people die, but during these power outages, people die. Like every politician, you can expect them not to do shit of what they campaign on. Okay, so while it is, you know, this idea of like politicians lie, what of it? That doesn't mean you let politicians get away with lying. That's not how that works. Could you imagine if you're like, if you're trying to raise a kid and like your kid lies to you about doing something and you find out they did it and you're just like, well, I guess there's no punishment deserved here because like kids lie. That's just something they do. No, the only way you're going to be able to correct that behavior is if you make them stop lying and make them stay committed to their political commitments. And now to add to all their misery, the innocent people of Yemen have to deal with a fuel blockade. The people of Yemen deserve our help. The blockade must be lifted as a humanitarian act. Otherwise, millions more will spiral into crisis. Later that month, the Houthis rejected a partial ceasefire proposal offered by Saudi Arabia, asking instead for a complete halt to the blockade and the air campaign. The intervening months brought no relief. Food prices rose in Houthi-controlled areas according to the Famine Early Warning System, a food security warning system created by the U.S. Agency for International Development. Goods imported through the Houthi-led north of Yemen must undergo a lengthy UN administration inspection process known as the United Nations Verification and Inspection Mechanism to check shipments for possible arms smuggling. But even after the UN VIM clears fuel shipments, the Saudi Arabian coalition controls whether and when these goods can reach Yemen. So let's say the UN VIM like goes in and says, okay, there's no weapons in here because the Iranian government is trying to smuggle weapons to the Houthis to help them. I don't want to get too much into it because it doesn't matter really when it comes to solving this humanitarian crisis. Like, we need to solve it. But the civil war in Yemen is a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Iran backs the Houthis, and so they try to smuggle weapons into the country to support the Houthis. So the UN VIM will go check this shit. But after they check it, that doesn't mean it just gets into the country. It is the blockade which determines whether or not that the fuel or food actually gets in. Anyway, so we could go through this article, and it's a really good article. The war has escalated, the bombing has escalated, the blockade is still in place. Everything that would be necessary for us to end this humanitarian catastrophe has not been done. It hasn't. I put the article in chat if anybody wants to read it. And what I want to say is simple. I don't think the Biden administration is going to move on this at all in the near future. In fact, I think that Biden is in a worse political position to do anything about this war than ever when it comes to where he was at the start of the administration, where he was now. Now that we're seeing this struggle over fuel prices, the Biden administration is going to feel more pressured to be, how you would say, conciliatory towards OPEC countries like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, etc., than ever. Which means that Biden is probably not going to make a massive move on this anytime soon. But that shouldn't be the case. Because what we're staring at right now is the biggest failure of the Biden administration. It is where Biden had a game plan. He set out a set of like goals he had to end the war, to end the humanitarian suffering. He reversed the Houthis being on the terror watch list. He started sending envoys to Yemen to try to bring about a ceasefire and an end to the suffering. And 1 year later, midterms coming up, he's failed. We've seen no progress on this. None. At least we hear murmurings about the Iran deal, the JCPOA, whether that's going to continue to move or not. This, we don't hear anything. We don't. And so while I recommend you go read the rest of this article, I just want to be blunt that I think that this is the biggest failure of the Biden administration. And that this is extremely disappointing, definitely considering that this is the main talking point I used to justify my vote for Joe Biden. There was other things that he has delivered on, and he has, of course, he's better than Trump. Nobody here probably disagrees except for the few chuds that are still in my chat from hippy dippy hours, okay? But it is a massive disappointment to see that Biden has yet to move on this issue, which he promised to do so, and he has yet to move forward with this plan, and he's now in a political position that makes it even more difficult for him to do it. And that the time for him to move on it was the first 6 to 8 months in office. And now it's going to be even more difficult for him to move on it, even though he should still, because it is a moral imperative that we move on this. Because you want to know what I hear sometimes when I bring up the war in Ukraine? And you want to know what? It is a whataboutism, but it's also somewhat valid, considering that more people have died in the war in Yemen. More people are starving in Yemen, or it has higher rates of food insecurity. It's like, oh, you want me to trust the American government to support the government in Ukraine? The same American government which is starving the Yemeni population? It's a reality that is true. It's just a true statement. Like, yeah, we are participating in the starving of that country. It is the Saudis that are operating it, but it is done with our implicit support. Tacit support, maybe, is a better word. Tacit. And so, while I think we're on the right side of history when it comes to Ukraine, and I'm happy to be an American being able to say, hey, look at that. We're on the right side of history. Isn't that cool? I think a lot of us have forgotten about the other conflicts in the world. I already made a video about Myanmar. Now this is my video on Yemen. While I don't think we are the ones involved in the slaughter in Myanmar, that is the government of Myanmar. In fact, I would say China is deeply involved in that. This is a slaughter we are giving tacit support to. 377,000 dead, millions at the brink of death. Well, no, hundreds of thousands at the brink of death, millions starving. This is the biggest failure of the Biden administration. This is also a quote from Wikipedia, the Houthi slogan, "God is great, death to America, death to Israel, curse the Jews, and victory for Islam," became the group's trademark. Let me be clear. An organization or government being bad does not justify you targeting the civilian population. Look, if you could make the argument that this blockade was going to bring an end to the war or was going to stop destruction, right? Like, someone can make the argument like, hey, well, these sanctions that we did here are going to make it more difficult for the Russian military to move into Ukraine. Or you can make some argument there. The Saudi military is incompetent. The Saudi-backed government in Yemen is incompetent. The Saudi air campaign has done more to destroy the history of Yemen, which I did a video on way back in the day. I did a video on that way back in the day about how the history of Yemen is being destroyed. Hundreds of year-old buildings destroyed because the infrastructure of Yemen is truly ancient in many ways. The government in Saudi Arabia is not going to win the war. I'm sorry. It's a reality. I just don't see a path forward for them to win. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not a military expert, but this has been going on for 7 years. And they've made no substantial gains. There is zero reason for us to continue to sign up to this war. We shouldn't have signed up to this war, period. But for us to definitely continue to sign up for this war and be involved in this slaughter. Zero reason whatsoever. 7 years. It's gone through Obama, it's gone through Trump, and now it looks like we're going to see it through Biden's term. Maybe the next president will deal with it. Who knows? Anyway, that's my position. This is the biggest moral failing of Biden's administration. I want to see a move on it. The article in full will be linked in the description of this video. And the war in Yemen and the blockade. Anyway, that's gonna be it for today, boys. I know views dip if I talk about Yemen. I'm incentivized not to talk about it, but it's still something I care a lot about because it was one of the conflicts that inspired me to get involved in foreign policy.